My name is Shannon Parker, and 3 months ago, I lost my husband in a fire that also took our newborn son. That day, the small church in Savannah was supposed to be a place of peace, a sanctuary where prayers would rise quietly for the ones I loved and lost. Sunlight filtered through stained glass, painting the pews in soft colors, and I tried to believe that the silence inside those walls could hold me together at least for one day when I needed calm more than air. The ceremony was meant to bless my son's memory, yet the moment my parents entered, the atmosphere shifted. They arrived late, murmuring excuses, the sound of their shoes echoing against the stone floor, as if they were stepping into a rehearsal instead of a baptism. I stood near the altar holding a small silver bowl filled with holy water, pretending not to see their eyes darting between the guests, pretending they weren't already judging the scene as if it belonged to them. When Father began his prayer, my father leaned forward and muttered, "Are we having a barbecue?" For an instant, I thought I had misheard. Then my sister laughed sharp and loud enough for everyone to turn. The sound shattered the hymn like glass breaking in a quiet room. I felt the bowl trembling in my hands, my chest tightening, my breath shallow. I stared at her smile, cruel and effortless, and something inside me broke. Without another word, I lifted the bowl and threw the water across her face. The laughter stopped, the whispers vanished, and even the bells outside seemed to fall silent. I did not cry. I only watched the water spread across the marble floor, and for the first time since the fire, I felt something close to strength. If you were standing there, would you stay silent or stand up for yourself? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to follow for what happened next. I barely reached the church doors before hearing my mother's voice rise behind me. "You humiliated us in front of everyone," she said, the words cutting through the air like a command. My father stood beside her, face tight, his tone even colder. "That was not grief, Shannon. That was a spectacle. You need help." And beside them stood my sister Renee, the one who had laughed during the baptism as if my pain were entertainment. She looked at me, folded her arms, and smiled slightly. "You should see a therapist," she said. "People are talking." I turned toward them, and for a second, all three faces blurred together, familiar yet foreign. They stood in a line near the steps like a small tribunal waiting to declare a sentence. Their judgment was so precise, it almost sounded rehearsed. I didn't respond. I walked past them toward my car, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. Behind me, my mother's voice softened into something meant to sound compassionate, but carried no warmth. "We only want what's best for you," she called out. I opened the door, slid inside, and shut out their voices. Driving home, the road stretched endlessly ahead, quiet except for the low hum of the tires. My body shook with a strange calm, the kind that comes when every emotion collapses into exhaustion. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sun had dipped low behind the houses, and my home looked smaller than I remembered. Inside, the air felt heavier. Marcus's photographs still hung on the wall, and I avoided looking at them. They reminded me too much of the promises my family had just shattered. I poured a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the lines in the wood. For years, I had believed that family was unbreakable, that no matter how flawed, blood meant loyalty. But that illusion had cracked completely. The people who had once told me to pray and forgive had mocked me in the one moment I needed kindness. I thought about calling them, maybe to demand an apology, but even imagining their tone, the mix of pity and superiority, made me feel sick. Over the next few days, I avoided every call from their number. Each voicemail that came through began with the same polished concern. "We're only worried about you. Don't isolate yourself. Renee said you haven't been thinking clearly." I deleted every message before it could finish. Their voices filled my house like smoke I couldn't breathe through. On the third night, I turned off my phone and sat in silence, the emptiness of the house pressing in from all sides. The next morning, a thick envelope waited in the mailbox. My name was printed neatly beneath the logo of Stellar Mutual Insurance, the company that handled Marcus's life insurance. For a brief moment, I thought it might be the final paperwork, a formality, another reminder that life had been reduced to numbers and signatures. I tore it open carefully, expecting routine language about confirmation or payment. But halfway through the letter, my hands froze. Before we proceed with the distribution of benefits, it read, "We require verification of a recent change in the designated beneficiary." I blinked, reading the line again. A change. There had never been one. Marcus and I had filled out those forms together 2 years ago in our living room. I could still remember him joking about how serious it all sounded for two people who barely owned anything. I was the only beneficiary. Always had been. There was no reason for this to be questioned unless someone had filed a request after his death. The letter included a copy of that supposed request. It was dated 2 weeks earlier. Marcus's printed name appeared at the top, but the signature beneath it looked uneven, too careful, as if drawn instead of written. Beneath it, another name had been added by hand. My eyes scanned the ink, the shape of the letters. It was a handwriting I knew better than my own. I set the page on the table, my heart thudding against my ribs. At first, I thought it had to be an error, maybe a clerical mix-up, but the details were too precise. Marcus's policy number, my address, the exact spelling of his name. I picked up the page again, staring at the loops and curves of the pen strokes. They were the same ones that had written me notes my entire life. Dinner at 6, call your sister, love Mom. The realization hit slowly then, all at once. The second name written on the form was my mother's. I pressed my fingers to the paper until it crumpled slightly. The room felt smaller, the silence thicker. My thoughts scrambled for an explanation that wouldn't break what was left of my trust. Maybe she had signed something without understanding. Maybe someone had convinced her it was temporary, maybe. But every excuse dissolved under the weight of what I knew to be true. This wasn't confusion. It was intention. I thought of the last few weeks, the sudden interest my parents had shown in Marcus's finances, the way conversations stopped whenever I entered a room, Renee's smug confidence when she spoke about moving forward. The pattern was there. I had just been too numb to see it. Every act of sympathy, every word of concern had been a mask. I smoothed the paper flat again, forcing myself to breathe evenly. My pulse slowed, but a different kind of clarity began to take its place. This wasn't about grief anymore. It was about betrayal, cold, deliberate, and orchestrated by the people who should have protected me. I sat there for a long time, listening to the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. When the phone rang that evening, I didn't move. I let it ring until the sound faded. I knew exactly who it was, and for the first time I no longer felt the need to answer. 3 days after the baptism, the quiet inside my house felt alive, thick with the kind of stillness that listens. Every sound, from the slow ticking of the wall clock to the faint creak of the wooden floor, echoed too clearly. When my phone rang, I hesitated, ready to ignore it like all the other calls, until the name on the screen made me pause. It was Aunt Tricia, who lived in Florida. We had not spoken since the funeral, and her timing made my pulse quicken. I answered. Her voice came low but firm, holding an urgency that made me sit upright. "Shannon, I need you to listen carefully. I would not call unless it was important." The tension in her tone was enough to silence every thought in my mind. "It is about your parents and Renee," she continued. "There is something you need to hear. I am sending you an audio file. Please listen to the whole thing before you react." The call ended before I could say another word. A message appeared on my phone moments later. The subject line read simply, "Proof." For several seconds, I just stared at the file, my thumb trembling above the play button. Something inside me already knew that whatever I was about to hear would change everything. Finally, I pressed play. At first, there was nothing but background noise, the hum of an air conditioner, the soft scrape of chairs on tile, the sound of someone pouring a drink. Then I heard my mother's voice. Calm, collected. "The policy should clear next week. Once it does, we will make sure the money goes where it should." The sound of my sister followed the smooth, mocking tone I knew too well. "And what if she finds out?" she asked, half amused. My mother answered immediately, her voice quiet but certain. "She will not. She is not thinking clearly enough to notice." Then came the sound that broke me. Renee laughed. "Even if she did, she would not fight us. She is too broken to fight anyone." The words felt like a blow to the chest. For a moment, I could not breathe. The recording ended soon after, replaced by silence that felt louder than any scream. I sat frozen, my phone still in my hand, my reflection in the dark screen strange and distant. I played it again, needing to hear each word to believe it was real. The same lines cut through me with surgical precision. "She will not need it. She is too broken to fight us." The repetition burned into me layer by layer until the tears came without warning. They fell quietly, my body shaking as I pressed the phone against my chest, hoping somehow to silence their voices. After a few minutes, I forced myself to move. I walked to the sink and splashed cold water on my face, but the reflection staring back from the mirror looked unfamiliar. The grief was still there, but it had hardened into something sharper. I called Aunt Tricia. She picked up almost immediately. Her first words were a whisper. "You heard it, did you not?" she asked. My voice came out strained but controlled. "Where did you get it?" "They came down here last month," she said. "Your parents and Renee. They talked about Marcus's policy at my table as if it were a business deal. They said things I could not ignore, so I turned on my recorder. I thought maybe I was imagining it, but now you know." I closed my eyes, imagining them sitting comfortably sipping coffee while plotting against me. "Thank you for telling me," I said quietly. "Please do not let them know you called me." "I promise," Aunt Tricia said, her voice trembling. "Just be careful. They think you are fragile." "I was," I said. "Not anymore." When the call ended, I sat for a long time in the dim light of the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed softly, and outside a single branch tapped the window with the rhythm of the wind. The world around me had not changed, but I had. The despair that had once drained me was gone, replaced by a cold steadiness I did not recognize, but welcomed. I took my laptop from the counter, connected my phone, and transferred the recording. On the screen, the file appeared with the name proof.mp3. I renamed it Evidence 1 and created a folder beside it titled Case. My fingers no longer trembled. My pulse slowed. For the first time since Marcus's death, my thoughts were clear. I listened to the recording one last time. Renee's voice filled the room again, confident and cruel. "She is too broken to fight us." I whispered to the empty air. "You are wrong." The words came out steady, almost calm. I closed the laptop, stood up, and looked out the window. The reflection in the glass showed a woman whose eyes no longer carried fear. They were steady, awake, and cold with purpose. The silence in the house, once unbearable, now felt like preparation. A week later, I walked into a quiet law office on Bay Street where the faint scent of coffee mixed with the paper and ink of long hours. Behind the desk stood Grant, one of my late husband Marcus's oldest friends, and the lawyer who had helped him draft every important document before the fire. He looked older now, the gray in his hair more pronounced, but his calm, steady demeanor had not changed. I sat down opposite him, gripping my bag tightly before placing a small flash drive on his desk. "Thank you for seeing me, Grant," I said quietly. "I know you were close to Marcus. I need your help." He nodded, once his expression unreadable but patient. "Marcus trusted you." I continued, my voice wavering slightly. "This is about his insurance. My family has done something, and I think I can prove it." He took the drive without hesitation. "Start from the beginning," he said. His tone carried no judgment, only focus. I explained everything: the strange letter from the insurance company, the recording Aunt Tricia had sent, the way my mother and Renee had spoken about taking what Marcus left. When I finished, he plugged the flash drive into his computer and pressed play. The recording filled the room, every cruel word spilling into the silence. I watched his face as he listened, every line tightening slightly until the file ended. He exhaled through his nose, thoughtful but grave. "That was your mother and your sister," he said evenly. I nodded. "And they mentioned the policy." Another nod. "Then this is serious. If your mother altered anything after Marcus's death, that's a felony." He turned to his screen, typing with quick precision. "Let's see what the insurance company has on file." The sound of the keyboard echoed through the small office as he accessed the records. After a few minutes, he turned the monitor toward me. The policy's beneficiary was changed 2 weeks after the fire. "According to this, you signed the form." My stomach dropped. He zoomed in on the digital signature, and the neat cursive letters twisted my chest into knots. "That isn't mine," I said immediately. Grant leaned closer, comparing it to another document. "You're right. The slant and spacing are off. It's close, but not convincing enough to fool someone trained to see forgery." He printed the page, highlighting a few sections before sliding it toward me. "This is criminal fraud. If Eileen submitted this, the claim will be frozen until further investigation." I stared at my mother's name on the document and felt a chill run down my spine. "So she signed my name," I whispered. He nodded once, not gently, but with certainty. "We'll contact the insurance company today. I'll handle the communication so your family doesn't get tipped off. They'll open an internal inquiry and suspend all transfers until the court hearing next month." He paused, lowering his voice. "Until then, do nothing. Let the evidence speak. The law moves slower than anger, but it moves with weight." The sentence lingered in the air, and for the first time, it didn't sound like legal advice. It sounded like something Marcus might have said. "Do you really think we can stop them?" I asked, not out of fear, but to test how sure he was. "It's not about stopping them," he said, closing the file. "It's about showing that what's right still matters." His words settled in me like an anchor. He stood, extended his hand, and added quietly, "Marcus believed in fairness more than anyone I've ever met. I'll make sure his trust wasn't misplaced." I shook his hand, my pulse steadying for the first time in weeks. When I stepped outside, the sun had dipped low, throwing long shadows across the street. I didn't feel weak anymore. The truth was now on paper, and it was heavier than anything my family could hide. At home, I walked into the living room, where Marcus's photograph rested on the mantel. The edges of the frame caught the evening light, and his smile, captured in that single frozen moment, felt like both a wound and a reminder. I placed my hand on the glass, whispering, "I'm doing this for you." The words felt steady, not like a plea, but like a vow to him, to myself, and to the justice that had waited too long to speak. 3 weeks later, the heavy doors of the Savannah City Hall closed behind me, with a sound that felt like the final lock on everything I had once called family. The hearing room was smaller than I had imagined, its pale walls reflecting the light from the tall windows and the restless air of expectation. I took a seat beside Grant, who sat poised with a folder of documents before him, his calm presence grounding the storm inside my chest. Across the table sat my parents and Renee, all dressed as if the truth could be hidden beneath tailored fabric and polite silence. The judge entered, a gray-haired man with measured steps and a voice that carried authority. "We are here to address the dispute regarding the life insurance and estate of the late Marcus Doyle," he said. Hearing my husband's name spoken aloud steadied me in a way that hurt. Grant began to present the case with precision, his tone firm but respectful. He laid out the timeline of events, the letter from the insurance company, the inconsistent signatures, and the discrepancies that led us to this moment. Every statement was backed with paper, every word deliberate. Eileen's eyes flickered with discomfort. Harold shifted in his seat, and Renee crossed her arms, her mouth twisted in quiet defiance. When the judge asked if they wished to respond, Eileen stood first. "My daughter must be mistaken," she said with brittle confidence. "She's been under extreme emotional distress since Marcus's passing. We only wanted to help her manage what was left." Renee nodded, her voice sharp. "This whole thing is ridiculous. She's trying to make us look like criminals. The room grew tight with tension, and I felt the faint tremor of my own pulse in my hands. Grant turned toward the judge, his expression calm but cold. Your Honor, my client has brought additional evidence. With permission, we'd like to play a recording relevant to the claim. The judge nodded. Grant pressed a button on the small speaker resting on the table, and for a few seconds the room was filled with static. Then came the voices. Eileen's soft tone unmistakable, followed by Renee's sharper one. If we change the paperwork now, no one will ever know. Then Renee's laughter. She won't need it. She's too broken to fight us. The words hung in the air like poison. No one moved. The faint hum of the overhead light was the only sound that dared to exist. My father's hand fell from the table, his face drained of color. Eileen's lips trembled, her facade cracking under the weight of her own words echoing through the room. Renee's expression hardened first into disbelief, then into panic. That's not me, she said, her voice rising. You edited that? Grant leaned forward, his tone measured but merciless. The original file was verified by the insurance company's forensic audio team. It has not been altered. The judge's eyes moved from the speaker to the faces before him. Do you wish to deny these voices belong to you? He asked quietly. Eileen opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The room held its breath. Harold exhaled sharply, his chest rising and falling as though something inside him had broken. Eileen began to cry, her shoulders shaking, her eyes wet with shame. Renee stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, the noise cutting through the silence like a blade. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the door. Her heels clicked in uneven rhythm until the door swung shut behind her. The judge folded his hands and looked down at the papers before him. Grant remained silent, allowing the moment to speak for itself. I did not say a word either. The need for explanation had vanished long ago. Everything they had done, every cruel whisper, every lie dressed as concern was now unmasked in front of the law. The judge lifted his gavel, and the wooden sound that followed seemed to split the air open. This hearing is adjourned until the final review, he said firmly. As the echo faded, I turned slightly toward Grant. He gave me a small nod, a gesture that needed no words. My eyes drifted to the empty doorway where Renee had disappeared, then to my mother's shaking frame. I felt no victory, only the clarity that comes when all illusions fall away. The truth was no longer mine alone to bear. It had been spoken aloud, and there was no taking it back. 2 months later, the echoes of the courtroom had long disappeared, replaced by the calm rhythm of a life that was beginning again. The verdict was final. Every asset remained under my name, the insurance documents restored, and justice, quiet but absolute, had found its way to me. That morning, outside the courthouse, the air of Savannah felt lighter, as if the entire city had been holding its breath for too long. Grant had rested a hand on my shoulder before leaving, a silent gesture that spoke louder than any word of congratulations. Justice had been served, but the cost of reaching it lingered. Word of the ruling spread quickly through town. Within a week, Eileen, my mother, was removed from her position as the church treasurer after the board reviewed evidence of altered ledgers and unauthorized withdrawals. Harold, my father, was soon linked to irregular financial records from his small contracting business. Local authorities began asking questions, and he quietly stopped attending church altogether. Renee, my sister, was the first to fall apart. Her employer, a private real estate firm, dismissed her after learning about the civil investigation. A few weeks later, I heard that she and her husband had separated. None of it brought me satisfaction. Watching my family unravel piece by piece did not feel like victory. It felt like the slow undoing of everything that had once defined me. There was no revenge in justice, only a hollow quiet that came after the truth was spoken. I sold the old house Marcus and I had shared. It no longer felt like a home, only a container of ghosts and promises that could never be revived. With the sale, I rented a small apartment overlooking the Savannah River. It was modest, a single bedroom, with wide windows that let the light spill in each morning. I filled it with small things that were mine alone: a coffee mug I loved, a thin blanket, a vase of lilies that bloomed in silence. Mornings came gently now. I would water the flowers, open the window, and let the wind move through the curtains while the world outside carried on without me. Evenings were quieter still, the sound of the river brushing against the docks like a steady heartbeat. I began working part-time at a design studio downtown. The work was simple, precise, and honest. People there were kind, and no one looked at me as if I were a story they had read about. For the first time in years, I was not someone's daughter, wife, or sister. I was simply Shannon. One late afternoon, as the sun bent low and gold light swept across the floor, my laptop chimed. A new email appeared, and when I saw the name, I felt an unexpected warmth. Grant Holloway. The subject read, "You did the right thing." The message inside was brief. "Justice may not erase pain, but it restores truth. You were brave enough to face yours." I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. "Thank you for reminding me that peace is not found, it's built." When I closed the laptop, I noticed my reflection in the window. The woman looking back no longer carried anger, only stillness. Outside, the river shimmered beneath the fading sky, stretching endlessly towards somewhere unseen. I whispered to the glass, to no one but myself, "I'm still here." For the first time, it wasn't a plea. It was a promise. 1 year later, the rhythm of my life had settled into something quiet and steady, like the slow current of the river that ran behind my apartment. The town I now lived in was small, resting on the southern edge of Georgia, where the air always smelled faintly of salt and pine. My days began early, walking to the insurance office where I worked as a claims analyst. The building was modest, its walls lined with framed certificates, and the hum of fluorescent lights that never quite matched the color of daylight. It was not a glamorous job, but it was peaceful, and peace was all I had wanted. I worked with people who greeted me with warm smiles and no questions, who didn't look at me as the woman from the headlines in Savannah. Here I was, just Shannon, another name on the employee roster, someone who submitted reports, answered calls, and left the office at 5. The simplicity of it became a kind of freedom. I rented a small townhouse by the river's curve. From my kitchen window, I could see the masts of fishing boats swaying in the breeze and the ripples that shimmered like glass under the sun. Every evening, I walked along the path by the water, sometimes passing couples with dogs, or children throwing stones into the shallows. They smiled, I smiled back, and nothing more was expected. I no longer spoke to my parents or to Renee. I had deleted their numbers months ago, not out of anger, but from understanding that silence was the only boundary strong enough to keep peace intact. Sometimes I wondered if they still lived in the same house, if my mother still attended church, if Renee had managed to find another job. But I never searched for answers. I had already buried that part of my life, not in bitterness, but in acceptance. One Sunday morning, on my way to the grocery store, I passed a small church by the roadside. Its white steeple caught the light, and the faint sound of a choir floated through the open windows. I stopped for a moment on the sidewalk, listening. The sound was soft, almost fragile, like something from another life. For a fleeting second, I remembered the day at the old church in Savannah, the laughter, the cruelty, the water glinting in my hands. The memory rose, and then dissolved. I smiled a real smile, the kind that comes from forgiveness, rather than forgetting, and kept walking. That night, as I sat by the window watching the river drift under the moonlight, I thought about how far I had come. There were still moments when grief brushed against me, gentle and familiar, like a wave that didn't want to harm, but couldn't help touching the shore. Yet even that ache had changed. It no longer held me. I had learned that healing was not loud. It did not come with applause or closure. It arrived in small choices to breathe, to wake up, to keep walking forward. I closed my eyes and whispered a quiet thank you to the universe, to Marcus, and to the version of myself who had refused to disappear. I finally understood that survival was its own form of grace.